I came back to India thinking my life was finally sorted. After years working in the United States, I managed to save $68,000. It was everything I needed, or at least that's what I thought. In the first few days, I just wanted to rest, enjoy my family, and help whoever needed it. And that's exactly what I did. I said yes to everything. I helped relatives, lent money, paid bills, did things I had never been able to do before. Except, I didn't notice one thing. While I was trying to be a good person, something was completely spiraling out of control. And when I finally stopped to look at my account, it was already too late. In just 3 months, almost everything I had spent years building simply vanished. And the worst part wasn't losing the money. It was understanding how I let it happen. If you think this could never happen to you, just wait until you hear the rest of my story. For years, my life in the United States was defined by hard work. I had no luxury, no real rest. I worked long hours, often in jobs nobody wanted, cleaning, cooking, night shifts. Whatever came up, I took it. My only goal was to save money. It wasn't just for me. It was for my family. I always told myself that effort would have an end, that one day I would return to India with a good amount, enough to live comfortably, help the people I loved, and finally slow down. And that day came. I brought with me $68,000. It might not sound like a fortune to some people, but to me, it was the result of years of sacrifice. Every dollar had a story. Every saving represented a sleepless night, a simple meal, a difficult choice. On the way from the airport to my family's home, I looked out the car window and tried to take everything in. The busy streets, the vendors, the constant honking. Not much had changed, yet at the same time, I felt different. I was no longer the person who had left years before. Now, I had something I had never had before, a sense of security. When I arrived, I was welcomed with hugs, smiles, and tears. My family was emotional, and so was I. It was impossible not to be. I was back, after so long, with something that could change our lives. In the first few days, everything seemed perfect. I didn't need to wake up early to work. No boss, no pressure. I woke up when I wanted, had my tea in peace, talked with my family. For the first time in many years, I felt like I could breathe. And that's when I started saying yes. At first they were small things. A cousin came to visit and mentioned, almost timidly, that he was going through difficulties. Nothing direct, nothing explicit. But I understood, and without thinking too much, I offered to help. "Of course I can help," I said. It was a small amount of money, at least in my mind. It didn't seem to make a difference against that total I had. Then it was an aunt, then a neighbor, then an old friend. The stories were always similar. Difficulties, debts, health problems, urgent needs. And I couldn't say no. In my mind, it made sense. I thought, I have it, they need it, why not help? And beyond that, there was something deeper. I wanted to be seen as someone who had made it. After so many years away, I didn't want to come back as someone who was still struggling. I wanted to show that all that effort had been worth it, that I had succeeded. And without realizing it, I began to associate generosity with personal worth. Every time I helped someone, I felt like I was fulfilling a role, as if it validated my entire journey. As the days went by, the requests started to increase. Some were direct, others came disguised in long conversations full of hints. But the result was the same, and I kept saying, yes. I also started spending on myself, nothing extravagant, at least at first. New clothes, gifts for the family, small home renovations, things I had never had the chance to do before. I thought, I deserve this. And in a way, I really did. But the problem wasn't spending. The problem was not thinking. I didn't keep track. I didn't monitor how much was going out. I didn't plan. It was as if that money were infinite. And at the same time, I made a decision that seemed innocent, but that changed everything. I decided not to work. After so many years of effort, I believed I had earned the right to rest. I told myself it was just for a while, a few months maybe. I wanted to enjoy life, enjoy my family, enjoy the time I had lost. And in that moment, it felt like the right choice. But there was something I was completely ignoring. Money was going out, and nothing was coming in. At first, that didn't seem like a problem. I had $68,000. It was a large amount, I genuinely believed it would last a long time, especially living in India. But I didn't account for the pace of spending. I didn't account for the impact of so much helping. I didn't account for the weight of small daily decisions. Each yes seemed insignificant, but together they began to form something much larger, something I still couldn't see. The weeks passed quickly. My routine was peaceful. I woke up late, talked, went out, helped someone here, bought something there, and the days went by without me noticing. From time to time, a small voice would arise in my head. Shouldn't you check your account? But I ignored it. I told myself everything was fine, that I deserved this moment, that there was no reason to worry. And deep down, I think I was afraid of discovering something I didn't want to see. So I kept living as if everything were under control, as if that money were enough for anything, as if tomorrow didn't exist. And that's how I entered the first month, without noticing what was already beginning to happen, without noticing that, little by little, I was losing control, without noticing that every choice was leading me somewhere it would be very hard to come back from. And, the most painful part of all, without noticing that my greatest intention, to help and live in peace, was silently becoming the beginning of my greatest mistake. The second month began as peacefully as the first. If someone had looked from the outside, they would have said I was living exactly what I had always dreamed. Unhurried, unpressured, surrounded by family, with time for everything that had once seemed impossible. But inside, something was already shifting, even though I still didn't want to admit it. The requests for help didn't stop. In fact, they increased. It was as if the news had spread. She came back from the United States. She saved money. She's doing well. These phrases began circulating among more distant relatives, old acquaintances, and even people I barely remembered. Suddenly, forgotten faces were reappearing with warm smiles and difficult stories. And I was still the same. I didn't know how to say no. One day, a cousin showed up saying he needed money to invest in a small business. He spoke with such hope, with so many plans, that I saw myself in him. I had dreams like that too once. Without thinking much, I helped. Another day, it was a family acquaintance with health problems. She needed money for tests and treatment. That touched me deeply. How could I refuse? And so the money kept going out, faster and faster. But what surprises me most today isn't even how much I gave to others. It's how much I started spending without realizing it. At first, they were just small things. Then they became habits. I started going to places I hadn't gone before. Better restaurants, more expensive shops. Nothing absurdly luxurious, but definitely above what I was used to. And the most dangerous part of all? I started getting used to it. That feeling of being able to buy without thinking, of not needing to calculate every expense, was something new to me, and, in a way, addictive. I told myself, you spent years saving, now you can enjoy it. And again, that seemed to make sense. But there was an enormous difference between enjoying and losing control. I just couldn't see that line yet. My family also started getting used to it. At first, there was even a certain carefulness, a certain respect. But over time, that faded. Requests began to be made more naturally. Can you pay for this? Can you help with that? It's nothing for you. That last phrase, I heard more times than I can count. It's nothing for you. And for a long time, I believed it. I looked at the amount I had brought and thought it really didn't make a difference, that it was small compared to the total, but nobody could see the whole picture. Not them, not me. There was a specific moment that stayed with me. A more distant relative asked me for a larger sum. It wasn't something small like before. It was a significant amount. I hesitated. It was one of the first times I felt real doubt. But, at the same time, came that silent pressure, that feeling that, if I said no, I would be being selfish, that people might change the way they saw me. And so, I said yes. In that moment, something inside me changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but that was where I began crossing lines I didn't even know existed. At the same time, I kept not working. Some people even asked if I wasn't thinking of doing something, even something light. But I always had a ready answer. This is my time to rest. And once more, that seemed justifiable. Except time was passing, and the money was shrinking. Even so, I avoided looking at my account. I created small distractions to avoid facing reality. I told myself I'd check later, that there was no rush, that everything was under control. But deep down, I was already starting to feel discomfort. Small, silent, but present. It was like a shadow beginning to appear at the corner of my awareness. Sometimes, at night, when everything went quiet, I would think, am I overdoing it? But I'd quickly push that thought away. I'd remember everything I went through in the United States, the hard nights, the exhaustion, the loneliness, and then I'd convince myself it was just a phase, that I had the right to live like this for a while. The problem is that this while had no defined end, and that was a mistake. In the middle of the second month, I started noticing something different in people. Some weren't just coming to talk anymore. They came with a purpose, with a request, and when I helped, there was gratitude, but also expectation, as if it would continue, as if it were guaranteed. And, in a way, I had created that myself. I had taught people they could count on me, not just emotionally, but financially, and I had set no limits. Without limits, everything starts to slip away. I also began to notice something in myself that bothered me. I no longer felt the same lightness as in the beginning. Before, helping brought me joy. Now, it was beginning to bring weight, but I didn't know how to stop. How do you say no after saying yes so many times? How do you change something that has already become an expectation? I felt trapped in something I had built myself, and yet I continued helping, continued spending, continued avoiding reality, until, near the end of the second month, something simple happened, but something that began to open my eyes. I went to make a routine payment. Nothing large, something ordinary, and for the first time, I felt a slight jolt. The balance in my account seemed smaller than it should be. It wasn't a shock yet, but it was a warning, a sign that perhaps something wasn't right. Even so, I still didn't have the courage to face it fully. I closed the app, took a deep breath, and told myself, I'll look at this calmly later. But that later was already coming, and when it arrived, I would not be ready. The third month began with a different feeling. It wasn't something I could explain clearly, but that lightness from the beginning no longer existed. It was as if something were out of place, and this time, I couldn't completely ignore it. That small warning I felt at the end of the second month hadn't gone away. On the contrary, it had grown. In the first few days, I tried to carry on normally. I kept my routine, kept helping when asked, kept spending as if nothing had changed. But now there was a new detail. I was thinking. Before, I simply said yes. Now, before responding, there was a pause, a small internal silence, a discomfort. And that started to bother me even more than the spending itself, because it meant that deep down I already knew something was wrong. Even so, I still didn't have the courage to face reality completely. I avoided opening the banking app, avoided doing the math, avoided anything that might force me to look at the numbers head on. It was as if, as long as I didn't see it, the problem didn't exist. But there is one thing you cannot avoid forever, the truth. And in my case, it began to surface slowly and cruelly. One day, someone from the family came to ask for help again. Nothing new. It had become part of the routine, but this time, the amount wasn't small. I felt a tightening in my chest. Something inside me said clearly, "You need to stop." It was the first time that voice had appeared so strongly. I stayed silent for a few seconds. The person in front of me kept talking, explaining, justifying, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was fighting with myself, between the person I had always been, the one who helps, who welcomes, who doesn't refuse, and the reality that was beginning to impose itself. And, even feeling all of that, I said yes. In that moment, I realized something that hurt more than any financial loss. I was not in control. I was no longer making conscious decisions. I was reacting, as if I were trapped in a pattern I had created myself and could no longer break. After that person left, I was alone, in silence, and for the first time, I couldn't run. I picked up my phone. My hands were slightly trembling. I opened the banking app, took a deep breath, and looked. The number that appeared on the screen didn't register in my mind for a few seconds. I blinked, looked again, tried to process it, but it was real. Of the $68,000 I had brought with me, only $4,500 remained. I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath me. My body went cold, my heart began to beat faster, and my mind entered a strange kind of silence. It wasn't immediate despair, it was shock, a shock so great that I couldn't even react. I stayed there, staring at the screen, trying to understand how it was possible. How had that money, which took years to earn, vanished in so little time? I began going back mentally, each act of help, each expense, each yes, each decision that in isolation seemed small, but that together had created a disaster. And then came the hardest part, the awareness. Nobody had taken that money from me by force. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't an accident. It was me. I allowed it. I chose it. I ignored the signs. I avoided reality. And in that moment, there was no escaping it. A feeling of guilt began to grow inside me. But it wasn't only guilt. It was something deeper. It was frustration. It was shame. It was regret. I thought about everything I had gone through in the United States. The exhausting nights, the difficult jobs, the times I said no to myself in order to save, and all of that, to end up here, with almost nothing. I felt like crying. But even that didn't come right away. I was numb, paralyzed before what I myself had caused. After some time, I don't even know how long, I finally managed to react. I closed the app, put the phone down, and pressed my hands to my face. I breathed deeply, several times, but the weight didn't lessen. In that moment, something inside me broke. The image I had built of someone who came back well, who had made it, who could help everyone, crumbled. And the worst part? Nobody knew yet. To everyone around me, I was still the same person. The one who could help, the one who had, the one who said yes. But the truth was something else. I was on the edge of a serious problem, with only $4,500 remaining. No income, no plan, and surrounded by expectations I had created myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop. Thoughts came one after another. What have you done? How did you let this happen? And now, that last question was the one that hurt the most. And now, because for the first time, I had no answer. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I had never had before. It wasn't just worry, it was weight, a real weight, as if something had been pressing on my chest from the moment I opened my eyes. For a few seconds, still lying down, I tried to pretend nothing had happened, that it had all been an exaggeration of my mind. But it only took a moment of clarity for the truth to come back with force. I no longer had $68,000. I had $4,500, and that changed everything. I got up slowly, walked to the mirror, and spent a few seconds looking at myself. There was something different in my eyes, something that hadn't been there weeks before. It was fear. For the first time since returning to India, I was afraid of the future. Until then, I had lived as if I were protected, as if that money were a guarantee against any problem. Now I could see clearly. I had no protection at all. And the worst part wasn't just the money that was gone. It was the situation I had created around me. People still expected me to help. They didn't know, and I didn't know how to tell them. That same day, it didn't take long for reality to knock at the door. Literally, a relative showed up, smiling, making normal conversation, and, as so many times before, came with a request. In that moment, something inside me froze. My body was there, listening, but my mind was somewhere else. I could only think, I can't anymore. But saying that felt impossible. There was an invisible pressure in the air, a silent expectation, as if that role, the one who helps, had already been assigned to me. And then, for the first time, I said no. It was simple, short, almost too quiet to be heard. I can't help right now. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The person's expression changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Confusion, surprise, perhaps even a little disappointment. But, you always help. That phrase hit me in a way I didn't expect. Always. As if it weren't a choice. As if it were an obligation. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken months to see. When you say yes all the time, people stop seeing it as generosity and start seeing it as a given. I tried to explain myself. I said things were different now, that I needed to get organized. But the words didn't seem to be enough. The conversation ended strangely. There was no argument, but there was no longer the same lightness as before. And when that person left, I felt something that hurt me deeply. Distance. A distance that hadn't been there before. That day, I made another difficult decision. I needed to speak with my closest family. They deserved to know. But at the same time, I felt ashamed. Ashamed to admit that, after so many years away, after so much effort, I had lost almost everything in so little time. Even so, I knew I couldn't keep hiding it. That evening, I gathered everyone. The mood was calm at first, ordinary conversations, laughter, until I interrupted. My hands were cold, my heart racing, and my voice didn't come right away. But I took a deep breath and spoke. I explained everything, from the amount I had brought to what was left. As I spoke, the atmosphere changed. Silence took over the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reacted immediately. And when I finished, came the response. It wasn't what I had imagined. There were no shouts, but there was something worse. Disappointment. Some eyes looked away. Others stayed fixed on me, trying to understand. And then came the questions. A lot of money was given away? You didn't keep track? Why didn't you think before? Each question was like a mirror, reflecting exactly what I was already thinking. And there were no easy answers, because the truth was simple and hard at the same time. I didn't think. I didn't keep track. I simply followed an impulse that, in the moment, seemed right. The conversation ended without a resolution, without a solution, just a shared weight. That night, the atmosphere in the house changed. Something that had once been light became tense, and I felt, more than ever, the impact of my choices. In the days that followed, reality showed itself even more harshly. The requests didn't stop immediately, but now each no created a small rupture. Some people pulled away, others changed their behavior, and some simply disappeared. It was at that moment that I realized something painful. Not all of these relationships were what I had thought. Some existed because I had something to offer, and when that was gone, they were gone too. At the same time, I began to do something I should have done from the beginning. Look at my life with responsibility. I sat down, took paper and pen, and started writing how much I had, how much I was spending, how much I needed to live. And for the first time in months, I thought about the future. Reality wasn't comfortable. $4,500 were not enough to sustain the lifestyle I had been living, much less to keep helping others. I needed to change, and quickly. That was when an idea began to take shape. Something I had avoided since the beginning. Working again. Just thinking about it, a mix of emotions arose. Exhaustion, because I had already worked so hard, but also necessity. This time it wasn't about saving money. It was about surviving and rebuilding. In that moment, I understood that the rest I had wanted so badly had perhaps come too soon, and that now I would have to pay the price for it. But at the same time, a small flame began to stir inside me, a desire to correct things, to start over, to do things differently. Even with everything I had lost, perhaps there was still a path forward, and for the first time since the shock, I began to think not about what I had lost, but about what I could still do with what remained. In the days that followed, I began to live a completely different reality from the one I found when I returned to India. Before, my days were light. Now, they were conscious. Every decision carried weight. Every expense was calculated. And every choice needed to make sense. The first thing I did was change my routine. It wasn't easy. After 2 months of living without schedules, without responsibilities, without pressure, returning to discipline felt like almost a shock. But this time, I had no choice. I started waking up earlier. Even without a job yet, I knew I needed to create a structure. I needed to show myself that I still had control over my life. In the first few days, I felt lost. I would sit with paper and pen, try to plan, but my mind always went back to the same place. How did you let this happen? That thought kept surfacing. But as the days passed, I realized that staying stuck there wasn't going to take me anywhere. What had happened. And as painful as it was to accept, I couldn't go back in time. I could only decide what to do from here on. That's when I started thinking practically. I needed income. Even if small at first, even if not ideal, I needed to do something. I thought about using what I had learned in the United States. I had experience with cleaning, cooking, organizing, simple work, but honest. At first, my ego tried to stop me. A voice inside me said, "You came back to rest, and now you're going back to this?" But this time, I didn't let that voice win. Because now I understood something I had ignored before. There is no shame in working. Shame is losing everything and doing nothing to change it. With that in mind, I began talking to some people, quietly asking if they knew of any opportunities. At first, it was uncomfortable, especially because some of those same people had seen me as someone who didn't need to work. Now, I was there, looking for exactly that. But surprisingly, there was also another kind of reaction. Some people looked at me with respect, as if they saw something different, perhaps for the first time, not as someone who could give, but as someone who was willing to start over. After a few days, a small opportunity came up. Nothing big, nothing stable. But it was a start, a simple job, helping with household tasks a few times a week. When I accepted it, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved. Another part was wounded, because it reminded me of exactly where I had come from. But at the same time, something was different now. Before, I worked just to survive. Now I worked with awareness, with responsibility, with learning, and that made all the difference. Meanwhile, my relationships with the people around me also changed. Requests for help decreased, but didn't disappear entirely. From time to time, someone still came by. But now, my answer was different. I thought, I analyzed, and most of the time, I said no. Not with anger, not with harshness, but with clarity. And that began to create a new kind of respect. Not everyone accepted it well. Some people really did pull away. Others grew colder. But for the first time, I began to understand who was there for me and who was there for what I could offer. That was one of the hardest lessons, and also one of the most important. At the same time, I started taking better care of the little money that remained. Every expense was written down. Every decision was thought through. And even though it was a small amount compared to what I once had, it began to carry much more meaning, because now I knew what it cost to earn it. There was one specific day that stayed in my memory. I was walking home after a simple day of work. Nothing extraordinary had happened, but as I walked, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of someone who has plenty, the peace of someone who understands, who has learned, who is finally seeing reality as it is. And in that moment, I realized something important. I hadn't lost everything. I had lost money. Yes, a lot of money. But I hadn't lost my ability to start over. I hadn't lost my experience. I hadn't lost my strength. And most importantly, I hadn't lost the chance to do things differently. That realization changed something inside me. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had failed and began to see myself as someone who had learned the hard way. Of course, the regret still existed, and probably it always will, because it's impossible not to think about what I could have done differently. But now, that regret no longer paralyzed me. It guided me, reminded me, kept me alert, and little by little, my life began to take on a new shape, simpler, more controlled, more real. I still didn't know exactly what the future would look like. There were still many uncertainties, but for the first time since everything happened, I felt like I was on the right path, even if that path was harder than I had imagined. And, perhaps, precisely because of that, it was the path I needed to walk. Today, when I look at everything that happened, it feels like I'm talking about someone else's life, but I'm not. It's me. The same person who spent years working hard in the United States, saving every dollar, and who, in just 3 months, lost almost everything. Only now, I see that story in a completely different way. At the beginning, I could only see the mistake. Today, I see the lessons. After I started working again, even in a simple way, something inside me began reorganizing itself slowly. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was real. Every small amount I earned began to carry a meaning far greater than before. Not because the money itself had changed, but because I had changed. Before, I saw money as something that needed to flow quickly, as if helping, spending, and distributing were always the best choice. Today, I see money as responsibility, as balance, as something that needs to be cared for, not out of selfishness, but out of awareness. My routine became simpler. I wake up early, I work, I come home, I write down my expenses, I think before making any financial decision. It might sound basic, but for me, it became essential. I also learned to observe the people around me more carefully. After I stopped helping financially, many things became clear. Some people really did disappear, without explanation, without goodbye. They just vanished. At first, that hurt, but later, it made sense. Because presence that depends on money is not real presence. On the other hand, some people stayed, even when I had nothing to offer but my company. And it was those people who helped me understand the true value of relationships. Today, I know exactly who is with me for who I am, and not for what I have. And that, in a way, is priceless. Over time, I also managed small improvements in my work. Nothing grand, but enough to bring a little more stability. And for the first time since everything happened, I began to think about something that had seemed impossible months before: rebuilding. Not in the same way, not in a rush, but with awareness. I no longer have the same amount I brought from the United States, but I have something that, back then, I didn't have: clarity. If I could go back in time, would I do everything differently? Yes, without a doubt. Would I help less? Not exactly. I would help better, with limits, with responsibility, with the awareness that helping others cannot mean destroying yourself. That was perhaps the greatest lesson of all, because for a long time, I believed that being a good person meant always saying yes. Today, I know that's not true. Sometimes saying no is what protects not only you, but the other person too. I also learned something about rest. I wanted to stop. I wanted to live calmly. I wanted to enjoy life, and that wasn't wrong. The mistake was believing I could do that without planning, without structure, without thinking about tomorrow. Today, I rest differently. It's not a complete rest, but it's a conscious rest, without guilt, without fear, because now I know I'm doing what needs to be done. From time to time, I still think about that number, $68,000, and then $4,500. The difference between those two figures represents far more than money. It represents a phase of my life, a phase of naivety, of emotion, of impulsive decisions. But it also represents the turning point where everything changed, because it was there, at the bottom, that I finally began to see. And if there's one thing I carry with me today, it's this: losing almost everything was painful, but it was what taught me what truly matters. If you're listening to my story, you might think this could never happen to you. I used to think that too. But the truth is, it doesn't start with big mistakes. It starts with small yeses, small decisions, small concessions, and when you realize you've already gone too far. If I could give you one piece of advice, it would be simple: help, be generous, but never forget yourself. Never forget to look at your numbers. Never forget to think about the future, because nobody is going to take better care of your life than you yourself. Today, I am still rebuilding, still learning, still walking forward. But unlike before, now I know where I'm going. And perhaps that is worth more than any amount I ever had. That was my story. And I will never forget the price of saying yes without thinking.